Hi, I'm Pastor Theron. Welcome to church where you are in your Wednesday Bible study. Thanks for joining me. If you're new to the channel, I'd like to say a special word of thanks for watching. I hope that you will consider subscribing, share this video with others, post it on social media, and let other people see it. I hope that you'll leave a thumbs up, maybe a comment down below, and I appreciate the views and the support. I began a study into the parables of Jesus and would like to introduce the idea of studying through one chapter at a time. Now, in this case, we're going to study Matthew chapter 13 and some of Jesus' parables found therein. The video last week is an introduction to that, and next week there'll be further explanation of this parable that we're going to go over today. So from Matthew 13, this is the parable of the sower. A parable is a story that makes a point, or it teaches the hearer, the listener, something in particular. But I think it's noteworthy to say that I went through some of my old notes as I was preparing for this message. And my old notes say that a parable was told to illustrate a single point. I've changed my mind in that and have decided that there are many layers to a parable. There are multiple dimensions to the layer. Now, there's one truth, but it conveys itself to different people and in different ways. We interpret it, we imply it, and we make it our own only after considering it from some of those various layers and different perspectives. So today we will study the parable of the sower from Matthew chapter 13, which begins in verse 3. And I'm be reading from the New International Version, and follow along in whatever version you like or on your phone. And the parable of the sower goes like this. A farmer went out to sow seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among the thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still other seed fell on the good soil, where it produced a crop, 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. He who has an ear, let him hear. This parable of the sower is a parable of three main characters as I am looking at it. There is the sower person themselves, there is the seed, and there is the soil. Now, it's difficult to take a parable and make it say too much. A parable is not necessarily an allegory where every little aspect has a deeper meaning. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't, and you have to determine that through careful study and application. I'm going to look at it from a very singular point of view in each one of these characters and how it might apply to each of us. After all, the Bible was written to an original audience. It applies to all people of all time, and applies to each one of us individually. So let's see if we can apply this particular parable as Jesus is sharing it with his disciples to ourselves today, and a broad spectrum of truth that comes from the Word of God. In order to understand how this parable applies, maybe we need to start with what a parable is. Well, a parable is a story, and the story teaches a particular thing. So I like to envision that Jesus is with his disciples, and they're on the hillside or out in the valley or something like that. There is a sower out there scattering seed. And so it may have been a teachable moment for Jesus to say, look, right here, in our midst there is a sower. Now let me take this moment and make it teachable. Let me teach you something right now. And Jesus begins to illustrate, or he begins to share this deeper truth with his disciples and for us too. We are the benefactors of this recorded parable, this recorded story, whether it was really happening or whether it just came from his imagination or he just thought it up or whatever. We can benefit from it. We can learn from it. So here is this sower. Now the sower is the farmer, the person who is scattering the seed. And let me set the stage for you. In ancient Palestine, as people would go out to scatter seed, they would have a vessel of some kind, like a big jar, a big earthen stoneware jar, and they would carry that under an arm, or they would sling it across the shoulder with some cordage of some kind, and they would reach in the jar and grab a handful of seed and scatter it. This is long before the days of machinery or things like that. Now they still would have plowed behind oxen in this, but when they went out to scatter seed, it was done by hand. The fields are these big flat open places, and there are raised almost like a levee. Very common sight in Louisiana. Rice fields and crawfish fields have this raised levee that holds the water and stuff in place. And so you can imagine that if you've seen that before, these levees, these walkways, these paths are raised up off of the field perhaps, or they're just an earthen path, and the fields would have been open on every side. And so as the sower reaches in and grabs a handful of seed, it would have scattered the seed. The sower doesn't have so much of an effect on the soil. We'll get to that in a minute. He prepares the soil either by plowing it or whatever. Sometimes the soil was plowed before the seed was scattered. Sometimes the soil was plowed after the seed was planted or scattered, and it was sort of pushed down into the earth that way. And it was just a various farming techniques. But the sower would have gone out with his vessel of seed, and holding the vessel would have reached in, grabbed the handful, and thrown it. And bigger fields, there's less accuracy. The bigger the field, the broader the broadcast of the seed. They would scoop out a handful and just throw it far and wide. When you're planting a garden, let's say, you make very specific holes in the ground. I used to start with just little containers full of potting soil and put individual seeds in little tiny holes and wait for the plants to sprout. And as they did, I would scoop them out and put them in the garden exactly where I wanted them to be. And sometimes I would even measure them out in the boxes if it needed a particular amount of space between each one or whatever. So sometimes it's very specific, but in this case, I can imagine it's a big field, and this sower is scattering seed far and wide. Well, the seed itself is another part of our story, another part of the parable. The seed would have been good quality seed. It wouldn't have just been mixed up bunch of junk. It would have been very specific seed, maybe wheat or barley or something like that. It wouldn't have been mixed together in a big field like that. You're not going to plant tomatoes and cucumbers and lettuce all together in the same handful. It would have been a big crop like wheat or barley or something like that. And so this vessel of seed would have all been one kind of seed. Whereas in your garden, you might plant different kinds of plants, but it's very specific. This is a further broadcast, a broader spectrum, if you will, of the size of the land. Good seed produces good results. It's where it winds up, we're going to find out, that makes all the difference. The soil, again, is the third part of our story here, and I don't like to look at it so much as the soil. That's later in the chapter, and as Jesus begins to explain this or really expound upon this parable, we get further into the soils and what each one means. So I'm not going to refer to it so much as soil, I'm going to refer to it as the ground. The ground is what receives the seed that is broadcast by the sower. And the ground, the earth itself, it receives the seed and has some variations to it. In fact, Jesus goes on to say, some seed fell on the good soil, some fell amongst the thorns, some fell upon the rocky places, some fell on the path. And it's the way the soil was prepared or not prepared. It's the way the ground was made ready for the seed, whether it was plowed, whether it was ready to receive the seed or not, in the way it responds to the seed and the way it is ultimately effective or not. And so here's Jesus explaining or telling this parable, and he's going to explain it later, beginning in verse 18, and we'll get into that next week. So I hope you'll tune in again. But Jesus begins to tell this parable, tell this story. Consider this. There was a person, a farmer, he says, who went out to sow seed. And as he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path. Now, as the sower goes out and reaches into the vessel to grab some seed, some of that seed would have fallen out of the vessel or fallen out of his hand and just fallen along the path that he was walking on, whether it was a raised levee or whether it was just a hardened path. That path has been walked on by lots of people using their fields, going out to their fields, the sort of a network of paths through the areas that are able to be farmed. And it's hard packed either by people's feet or by carts or by animals or whatever, but it's hard packed soil. It's not been tilled up. It's not ready to receive the seeds. It's not prepared. The soil must be prepared. And so some of that seed falls along this path. It's hard packed. It's not able to let the seed sink down into it. It would be like our modern day sidewalks or paved roads or something like that, that the seed just sort of sits on the top surface. He says, some falls along the path, and the birds came down and ate it up. The seed is exposed. The birds see it. They come down and get it. This seed was obviously not effective into the ground where it was dropped, where it was going to be sown, but it wasn't really sown there. It was just sort of dropped there, sort of accidentally. So this farmer is broadcasting seed. Some of it falls on the path. Some of it fell among the rocky places. Now, we like to think of rocky places as those places that are sort of part dirt and part rock. I can think of in my youth digging holes in the fields around my house in various places and hitting a rock every once in a while and having to dig around it, and there's just chunks of rock or whatever. And that's not exactly what's taking place here. It's better described as a rock shelf. So there would be a stone, sort of a layer, if you will, covered with soil. And so the layer underneath is rock, and then there's soil on top of it. As the sun begins to get higher in the sky in planting season and as time passes on, that stone underneath the soil, the rock underneath the soil, warms up quicker than any of the other ground around it. And so the seed germinates very quickly and it springs up very quickly. The problem is that if it comes up too quickly and the plant gets too tall before it has really established a good root, or in this case where there isn't root to dig down into the soil and find any moisture, that stone is going to dry out the soil and it's going to sap away the moisture, and it's eventually that plant is going to dry up and wither. And some of the seed fell among places like that where the soil was very shallow. When the sun came up, the plant was scorched and they wither, because they had no root, because there wasn't room for that root to get down in there. There was no moisture for that root to reach to with a stony shelf underneath the soil. Other seed, he said, fell among the thorns. Now the thorns are the edges and the corners of the field. This is soil, this is land, this is ground that has not been prepared. It has not been tilled up. It has just been neglected. It's been ignored. Maybe it's around a tree or around a big rock that sticks up out of the ground, or a place that isn't used very often. The corners of the fields don't get taken care of, or underneath the fence row, the weeds and the thistles and the The thorn bushes grow up in those places. Well, as they're scattering seed far and wide, walking along the path, those places would be right there. And so seed is falling on the path, and it's being broadcast into the shallow soil areas, and some is falling into the soil that has not been prepared ahead of time. It's falling among the thorns and the thorn bushes, and that is fertile soil. The problem is that all the real estate is taken up by other plants. So the roots of these other plants are taking all the nutrients out of the soil long before these seeds can get germinated and begin growing the plant. And so they grow up among other plants and they get choked out because the little seed, as it begins to germinate and the roots begin to go deeper into the earth, they meet other roots, and the other roots have already taken them all the nutrients, or the other roots choke out, are bigger and stronger, and choke out the little seedlings that are beginning and trying to germinate. And so it's trying to grow. The problem is that the roots of the other plants choke it out. But other seed, he said, other seed fell on good soil, and it did produce a crop. It produced a crop so good, in fact, of 100 times, 60 times, 30 times. I'm reminded, I'm originally from Idaho. I grew up on the border of Washington State and northern Idaho, between Montana and Washington, and agriculture is a big business up there. I was out visiting a friend of mine, and I have family land out in some of the same areas, flat prairie land, and where they will plant wheat. Wheat will spill over into the ditch, and it will grow in the ditch, or it'll actually grow up right along the edge of the road. And these lovely little plants grow up. They don't get very tall, but they will produce a wheat head, and they'll have 10 or 12 kernels in them. Whereas in the field, where the soil has been prepared correctly and where it's ready to receive the seed, the one wheat seed that is scattered in the field might have a big head of 30 or 60 or 100 more wheat seeds within it, which is eventually processed and ground down to make flour and whatever. And that's what Jesus is saying. These seeds that fell on the good soil, they produced a crop. They produced a crop of a big head of wheat or barley or whatever, full of the seeds, full of the grain, the same thing as what was planted. Now, if we are to apply this, if we were to take this information now and say, how does that apply to me? How does that apply to you? How does it apply to the original audience? How does it apply to all people of all time? How does it apply today? I would say this: you're the sower. You are the sower, and you are scattering seeds. You are scattering truth. You are scattering your words of wisdom. You are scattering words of counsel. You are scattering words of encouragement and hope and positivity. And sometimes we do it on purpose, and sometimes we do it accidentally. But I would say this: there are always recipients. There are people out there that are overhearing your conversations. There are people out there that are listening in as you're talking on the phone, walking down the road, whatever you might be. It's not evil. It's just that they just overhear your conversation, or they overhear your conversation, your words, you talking to somebody with you or on the phone. They are picking up what you are scattering, what you are broadcasting. Other people do it more intentionally. Perhaps you're a teacher. Perhaps you're a counselor. Perhaps you're an evangelist or a preacher. And especially for those of you who are young and new at it, you're broadcasting truth. You're doing it on purpose. There is a point to your broadcasting. I would say be careful what you're throwing out there, because there's always people that are going to hear. There's always people who are going to understand. And even more than that, your actions speak louder than your words. The way you conduct yourself, the way you live, and the way you interact with other people is your truth and your life being broadcast into their lives. I would encourage you to be very positive. Stay focused, stay energetic, stay enthusiastic. Keep negativity to a minimum, because that falls on soil as well. Not only does positive things, evangelism and teaching and counseling, fall on good soil, but so does negativity. And negativity are seeds that will just take over a fertile land of a person's heart and mind, and we need to be very careful with that. For those of you who are attempting to do this as a calling or as a vocation, you're trying to get into teaching or counseling or preaching or evangelism or whatever it might be, take the truth that is found in this. Of the 4 recipients, the ground being the recipient, only 1 produced a crop. The other 3, that'd be 75% of the efforts that the sower was putting into this, whether it was accidentally dropped seed or whether it was scattered amongst the thorns or whether it was scattered amongst the shallow ground. The sower didn't matter so much about where they threw the seed, but that they threw the seed. And I believe that's true. I believe God blesses our efforts and our faithfulness in doing this. And that's partly why I keep doing this week after week, is I'm trying to be faithful to what God has called me to do. Do not grow weary in well-doing. Let your conversation be seasoned with salt. Be positive. And share the gospel as you have opportunity. And when needed, use words, because your actions speak louder than words. Maybe you're doing direct evangelism. Sometimes your evangelism is going to fall on good soil and it's going to produce a crop, and this person's going to become a Christian and a believer, and they're going to start going to church and doing all of this. But it would seem more often than not that it's going to fall amongst these other places. Don't give up. Keep pursuing that. But we also do evangelism indirectly. People watch the way we live. They watch the way we conduct ourselves. We must be careful to stay positive, both in word and in deed, because people are watching. Sometimes young people, sometimes impressionable people. There's always somebody who is watching you, and they're learning from you, whether it be positive or negative. So sow good seed, but scatter it broadly. The other way to look at this is that sometimes you're the sower, but sometimes you're the ground. Sometimes you're the recipient of the seed that is scattered by someone else. And how you receive this determines how it is applied in your life. How do you receive instruction? How do you receive criticism? How do you receive correction or rebuke or rejection? How does that affect you? How does that, what kind of soil in your heart and mind, in your life, do those seeds fall upon? Well, it's easy to accept positive comments. It's easy to accept praise. That always falls on fertile soil. But what about well-meaning people who have your best in mind, and so they come to you and they say, hey, I think you could improve this way, or here's some criticism, or here's some instruction. I've had many people through my life, and especially in the churches that I've pastored, come to me and say, this, I believe this, or maybe you could apply it this way, or take this under consideration. If we let that instruction fall on the ground that is consumed with our own thorns of self-righteousness or bitterness or pride, it might choke out that good instruction. If it falls along the path and we're just not ready to receive it yet, or maybe it falls in that shallow soil and it springs up and we think this is great, but we don't carry it to completion. Sometimes negativity is broadcast in our lives, and I would encourage you not to let that fall on the good soil. Don't let the negativity, don't let the criticism and the correction negatively fall on the good soil in your life. Let it fall along the path. Let it fall amongst the thorns. Don't believe it. Let it just blow away in the wind of positivity, and let the birds of joy and happiness come down and scoop it up and carry it away. Don't let it linger. Don't let it try to even germinate or take root, but just let it go. Let that negativity go. You have some control over the way you receive the things that are broadcast into your life. Sometimes you're the soil, sometimes you're the ground, the recipient of these things, but you don't have to let it germinate in your life. You don't have to let it take root and burrow down in there. Let it fall amongst the path, let it fall amongst the thorns, or the blessed plants of your life, the ivy and flowers and beautiful places where all that soil is taken up already, and those seeds of bitterness and discontent and discord can be choked out by positive things and joy. Sometimes you're the soil, the ground. Sometimes you're the recipient. Sometimes you're the sower. And I think that there is a way to apply this parable to each of us. It's not one truth that I was trying to find in my youth. I have grown from that. I have learned. I've found instruction and correction in that, and I've let it take root and germinate in the good soil of my own life. And I'm trying to apply that now. And I'm going to try to keep scattering seed. I'm going to try to keep broadcasting the good seeds, letting the harvest grow up, and give God all the credit for it. I hope this speaks to you. I hope it blesses you. Thanks for watching.